We are now broadcasting. Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining today's energy talk dedicated to battery storage opportunities for emerging markets. While these are very difficult times for the events industry, we at the Investing Network continue to take steps we believe are necessary to uphold our mission of fostering the deployment of renewable energy. For the time being, this is only possible via online events, and we very much appreciate your participation and support. And if you have an idea for an energy talk and would like to be involved in one, naturally, we would be thrilled to hear from you. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items so that you know how to participate in today's session. At any time during the session, you will have the opportunity to submit your questions to today's speakers. To do so, just type your question into Q&A at the bottom of the control panel. As time allows, our speakers will address as many questions as they can during the Q&A at the end of the session. And as an attendee, you can see all the questions posted and you can upvote them and even comment on them. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our speakers, Patrick Clarence, Secretary General of the European Association for Storage of Energy, Emin Askarov, Director General of Renera, Peter Mockels, Principal Industry Specialist at IFC, Julian Johnson, Associate Director at IHS Markit, and Luis Munieras, Smart Grids Technology Lead at IEA. I would like to thank our knowledge partner, the European Association for Storage of Energy, and our speakers for making this event possible. Huge thanks to our media partners, Business Hub, Batteries International, Solar Business Hub, Foresight, Interfax Ukraine, and Vogue News. For the Russian-speaking audience, please check out industry seminars by NP Soviet Ringa. They are really useful. Thank you, and Patrick, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Inessa. Thank you for introducing this and inviting me to chair today. It's a very interesting topic. We feel that the deployment of renewables and energy storage, which is facilitating the deployment of renewables and bringing flexibility to the market, is the key to roll out enough renewables without having curtailment or spillage, and also to deliver the flexibility which is needed. But it's a jigsaw puzzle. It's not so easy to have it deployed everywhere, and what should you look at? And today we will have the 4 presentations where Luis will first present some overall trends of energy storage deployment and maybe some specific scenarios for deployment of storage in the Central European or Asian countries. After this, we will have Peter, who will look at how to make a project bankable, because it's not enough to have a project. Obviously, you need to get the revenue for this. And I'm very interested to looking forward to his presentation. Then Julian will have some case studies about how to get projects started and how you can have the revenues for them, and this revenue stacking, which is a big question. Are you allowed to have different services served at the same time? You're getting revenue from your device for the different services. And then finally, we'll have Emin, who will explain a bit more some strategies about how the country needs to position itself. Do you need own manufacturing in your country? Which skills are needed, and so on and so on. So it will mainly touch on energy storage, but obviously not only. And it will look at the energy systems as such. And at the end, we have Q&A. So if you want to write down your questions in the chat, we can address them at the end of the presentations. With this, I would like to hand it over to Luis. Luis, the floor is all yours. You need to share your screen on the bottom, and then
Thank you, Patrick. Can I just get a thumbs up that the screen is being correctly shared? All good. Thank you.
It's a presentation. It's not a presentation. Now it's a presentation mode. Yes.
It's full screen mode. Okay. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation on behalf of the IEA to give our views, our perspectives on what's happening on energy storage around the world, and some notions of what would be relevant for the audience today, Eastern European countries and regions where you're considering how to deploy storage, what are the areas that you should be looking at, what are the concerns, challenges, and the opportunities. So let me just start very quickly with some of the terms that I'm going to be using in the next 12, 15 minutes, which are the main scenarios that we use in the International Energy Agency. The first scenario, which I'll point out, is the stated policy scenario, which is a scenario where technologies like storage, anything in the energy sector, power generation technologies, wind and solar, efficiency on the demand side, everything is deployed according to policies that are either in place already today or they have already been announced. So there's a sense of what is the inertia that the markets have today. Then we have this scenario, which I'm going to point out at the bottom here, which is a sustainable development scenario, where it's a scenario that has, of course, a lot more renewables, of course, a lot more clean energy, and as a result, a lot more storage. And this is because it's a scenario that meets the goals of the Paris Agreement, to stay well below 2 degrees by 2100. And it also meets other goals of energy access, of affordability, of air pollution, and so on, where also storage has some role to play. And then here we see the different technologies that kind of get us from that trajectory of emissions in the stated policy scenario to the sustainable development scenario. We see a big role there for renewables, and for efficiency, and for fuel switching. But I will focus particularly on renewables, where you see there a very large scale up of wind, solar, variable renewables, large electrification from the demand side, which overall needs a lot more flexibility. And that's where really storage comes into play. So when we look at storage today, I mean, storage batteries are terms that tend to be used interchangeably. When we say storage, we do tend to mean batteries. And they do tend to get most of the headlines, but it's important not to forget about technologies, for example, like pumped hydro, as well as other more traditional forms of flexibility. So over the next 5 years, we see actually as much pumped hydro being deployed as battery storage in gigawatt terms. After that, we do see, of course, batteries taking over. There's many emerging markets that are still using pumped hydro, relying on pumped hydro in Asia, in Northern Africa. Of course, there's challenges with that. It's much more capital intensive, has long lead times, but it still has its place. Now, when we look at what is the technology mix within this kind of wedge that is not pumped hydro around the world, what we see is that in 2012, and this is kind of the first year where we see kind of a significant deployment of storage, we have some scale, and we can judge which are the technologies that are more relevant. There we see that from then to 2018, and last year already, we saw this even more pronounced, a predominance of lithium ion tends to be most widely used. There's many reasons for that. I'll go into them in a second. Scale up of EVs, consumer electronics that have driven down costs. But what we see there is a predominance of lithium ion. We do have these other technologies there, which is this purple band. And there's a lot of recent interest in alternatives to lithium ion, particularly for long-term storage. So we have thermal storage, compressed energy storage, flow batteries, gravity storage. And these are now having a resurgence for the perception that perhaps for longer durations, lithium ion may be less attractive for now. Now, there's another myth that we hear quite often, and for countries that are looking to start deploying storage, this is quite important to consideration, which is that storage is already being driven by the market, and that's what's driving an exponential growth. So we saw last year that almost 30% less storage was installed in 2019 than the year before. So there was a contraction of the storage market. And the factors behind this trend, what they do is they really underline how much storage still, especially batteries, still an early stage technology. It's present in a few markets and it depends heavily on policy support. So whenever we have seen strong environment that facilitates the services storage can provide, there we see a market that can grow quite quickly. The reverse is also true. So there's been some markets like in Korea, for example, where certain concerns around safety of batteries rapidly decreased support and rapidly contracted the market. So here the message is when markets start in a country, they have grown fast, as we can see in this image, but that growth needs to be stable over time. Now, if we move into how the batteries today are being deployed around the world, for what kind of applications? So since 2012, we see this range of applications has been shifting. To date, a key driver of growth in energy storage has been co-location of renewable energy production facilities with energy storage assets. This is perhaps the most popular application. It's within that dark green portion of the figure. This is very attractive. It stabilizes production. It ensures firmer capacity during peak demand periods. And in particular, within this category, what many countries are finding quite attractive is utility scale renewables plus storage projects that in particular, they address interconnection challenges. So this is really the trend that we saw last year where these projects kind of exploded around the world. And really the focus there on addressing those interconnection challenges. Then we see ancillary services. These are becoming more sophisticated. That's the dark blue there. So it might look like it's shrinking. Overall, the market has grown a lot. So even if the share is shrinking, the number of projects and the capacity is increasing a lot. And these are becoming more sophisticated. But the more interesting one here is that light green, which is the T&D category, which is expanding quite quickly. And the idea here, battery storage, it can really help regions to be more self-sufficient, to improve security of supply. If there are regional projects occurring that are proving to be more difficult than anticipated in the beginning. And in Eastern Europe, there's a number of examples of that. But elsewhere, in regions that have particular issues in developing new transmission corridors, expanding distribution networks to new areas, like for example in France or in Germany, these are actually gaining a lot of traction. And here maybe a final point to make is that because batteries are so modular, it's important to distinguish when thinking about which applications to incentivize and how to incentivize them between large scale and small scale applications. So when we look at an emerging market context, going far down the low voltage network has significant issues. It has added complexity from the technical side, but also from the regulatory perspective. So transmission scale systems, it's quite attractive to have an early focus on that, particularly given the economies of scale that one can get on the value side of the equation. And I'll speak about that more in a second. Now, another interesting trend that we've been seeing is that really behind the meter batteries are occurring, whether utilities regulators want them or not in different countries. This is a trend that's happening around the world. And it already overtook grid scale batteries in 2018, the batteries behind the meter. And we've seen last year, even though this year we, from the preliminary data we have, it's a slightly different picture. But we've seen that even if grid scale batteries maybe have not kept the pace that we expected, behind the meter is actually really making up for that. In particular, in some countries where role of the aggregator has been enabled, or new business models like virtual power plants, they are really gaining traction quite quickly as a way to manage a lot of behind the meter batteries and distributed assets. Now, if we look at the longer term. So what is the longer term perspective? So we've looked to date, what's happening, what do we think around the IEA, what do we expect in the coming years? So the outlook for batteries, as we said, I mean, maybe there's a retrenchment last year. Preliminary numbers that we have, preliminary numbers that we have this year, they're showing 5 gigawatts, between 4 and 5 gigawatts of batteries around the world, which is already a return to growth of the market. When we look into the future, we see the outlook is actually further improved. There's the prospect of economies of scale, particularly from the transport sector, where there's a lot more batteries that are being built for that. So the cost will continue to go down, as you see there. However, it's important, especially in the context of a new market, to consider that the storage system is not only the battery. So there's always the headlines about battery cost reductions, but system costs, non-battery costs, things like inverters, like housing, even EPC, even the actual process of building the battery system and deploying it, they are actually exclusive to the power sector. So regardless of what is happening in other sectors like EVs, that will for sure push the cost of batteries down. There is a lot of learning opportunity from deploying in the local context. And that is really the biggest hurdle that we see locally in terms of this cost trend. In terms of what is expected from our side and on the scenarios, we still, as you see here on the graph on the right, the sustainable development scenario in particular, it sees a very large deployment of batteries over the next 20 years. In particular, it's the need for modularity, fast response capabilities. These continue to be drivers of innovation and to continue to reduce costs. And here, of course, it's not enough to have these cost reductions. There's a lot of regulatory reform and progress that is needed. There's going to be other presentations later on that are going to be discussing this in a lot more detail. Different market creations, frequency control, ancillary services, capacity mechanisms, etc. But just to say here the point that this doesn't happen on its own. As I said, it's very heavily dependent on policy, regulatory design. And these market measures would help business case for investment in storage. Now, as I said, into the future, we do expect these trends to continue. What we see here is how much influence other sectors are having in terms of what's going to happen in the power sector. So we see, you see there on the graph on the left, consumer electronics have been kind of dominating lithium-ion batteries around the world. With the growth of EVs, more and more batteries are being made for EVs. And you see there storage, that red band that is relatively very small. This is grid scale storage, behind the meter storage, relatively small compared to how many batteries are being built in other sectors. And so not surprisingly, if you look at the graph on the right, most of the patents, most of the innovation is actually happening for automotive applications. And the red line there on the graph on the right at the bottom, that's how much is happening for stationary applications, so for storage as we understand it now. So that has some important implications for the power sector, where there will be a lot of cheap designs from batteries coming from the automotive sector that are maybe a generation behind, and they can be easily adopted more cheaply for the power sector. So it's second life batteries, but also just chemistries, technologies that are less performing already, and the power sector can absorb them. Just to show you, when we look into the future, that's the same graph that we were seeing before, but this is the contrast in terms of how much is going to be built, but how many batteries are going to be built for different applications. And you see that it's even more dominating the passenger EV side versus how many we expect will be deployed on for storage purposes out to 2040. And then one final slide. I see I'm doing okay with time. So one final slide, which is really to make the point that these cost trends are very interesting. They're happening around the world. There's the question mark as to current generation of lithium-ion, how much more cost reduction potential there is. As I mentioned, for power, it's very important to focus on everything that's around the battery as well. But once we're moving from the phase of considering costs only, or having an important focus on costs, then it's important to consider value. So what is the value that brings to the system? So here, what we see on the right, that is a measure that, I mean, I can detail in the question times, which is called the value adjusted cost of energy, in this case of solar, and then solar with storage, that captures the value side of the equation as well. And by value, we mean the energy value, the capacity value, the flexibility value, which is not cost. It's actually the value that it has for the whole system. And these are relevant in all systems. Maybe they're not visible in regulated markets, and in competitive markets where those exist. They may also not be monetized because the markets do not exist right now, the flexibility markets, the capacity markets, and so on. So investors may not be getting the right signals. So the point here is, once we have these in place, that these measures that can extract value, that can signal the value, then there is a different case for storage. This is really the point to be made here. Solar PV with storage has a completely different. So costs do remain important, but we need better metrics to assess the changing nature of power systems. So with that, I will end here. I welcome any questions from the audience, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luis. So we have now 2 questions, but I would propose, because they're also touching on other presentations we had before, or we'll have afterwards, sorry. I will take these questions down, and then we come back to this in a moment when we have the Q&A. So thanks, Luis. So I don't see any questions regarding the understanding. So it's clear what you presented. And it was quite interesting to see that actually dispatchability is one of the important things which we see in the system. Thank you very much, Luis. And then we will now go on to the second speaker, which will be Peter. And we will have to change the slides. So you should somehow stop sharing, Luis, and we should have Peter who should be sharing the slides.
All right.
Perfect.
So you can see my screen?
Yes, it's perfect. We see your screen. And please, the floor is all yours. I will switch off my camera.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. My name is Peter Merkel. I'm an industry specialist with IFC, the private sector part of the World Bank. And the 30 seconds of corporate propaganda. We're part of the World Bank Group. We are the private sector part of the World Bank Group, in that we lend to private sector companies and projects. We are owned by 185 countries and operate in 100 countries. And mostly what we do is infrastructure investment, and a lot of that is wind and solar project financing. But we look for the next big thing. And we think that energy storage will be one of the new topics that'll keep us busy in the next few years. So I'm going to talk from the investor perspective, but also I'm talking from the East Coast of the USA. And incidentally, even if batteries haven't been invented here, at least the term battery has been invented here. So that's something. So Benjamin Franklin, not far from here, in Philadelphia, first used the term battery for an energy storage device. So even though the battery, of course, came from Europe, that's some historical link. I'm going to talk about bankability. We're an investor, both in project finance, debt, and also in equity in companies that deploy energy storage. And I'm going to talk what are the main obstacles from more lending going into the sector. First of all, we share the long-term vision that energy storage will lead to 24/7 firm renewable energy. That's where we want to go. We see by the end of the decade that this is competitive with thermal base load. It's dependable, dispatchable, and the end game is 100% decarbonized grid. The main obstacles we're seeing are a chicken and egg problem, that we can only make these projects more efficient and cheaper if we do more large projects. This is not just about lower cell cost, but lower balance of plant cost. And we need to do gigawatt hour scale projects to get there. And I come back to that again and again. That's one of the main consistent, stable regulatory regimes in emerging markets. markets. Our lens, we're all about emerging markets. Business model standardization, we need PAs for these projects, and new financing. The number one top, before we even, they tell us, well, first of all, we need a stable regulatory regime. We need a system that remunerates storage for the services it brings into the and that's, if we have that, then we can talk about financing. So it's in our interest as an investor to get to stable regulation. And further obstacles we see in the future is that lithium-ion batteries will asymptotically reach a floor of cost reduction. That beyond that, in the second half of this decade, we will need more fundamental technology innovation. And the regulation also determines that for refinancing these projects, we need the remuneration of services on top of energy, for example, ancillary services, to make them more bankable. The point about PPAs is really important. When you look at solar and wind projects today, a PPA in Mongolia looks the same as a PPA in Guatemala, and they're very easy to benchmark and evaluate against each other. In storage, that's not the case. And if anything, it's getting more complicated. So there are variations on energy payments, either, for example, when you pair storage with solar, you can have a blended LCOE for peak and off peak. You can have a it's a net
Peter,
energy. Yeah.
Peter, you're freeze from time to time. Maybe it's good to switch off your camera and just try to speak without the camera.
Yes, okay. Got it. Standardized PPAs are very important in that they become comparable across projects, and you don't have to start from first principles to analyze a new project. The most recent developments we've seen is point more to differentiation and not to a convergence on a standardized model. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind. In terms of risks that we see as a lender and an investor, that we need to get to consistent safety standards. There's still concern around safety. We had the Arizona accident last year that spawned a number of reports on safety. We need qualified personnel and subcontractors, especially in emerging markets, with qualifications to install and maintain these systems. And for example, a topic that has recently come up for us is the desire for clear termination rules on contracts, and that's been especially with the terminal value of battery plants at the end of life of a project. That's also something that needs to be standardized. So from investor perspective, this is going to be both market, but it's going to be more complex than for wind and solar, and it's going to be remaining more complex than wind and solar. We will focus on lithium-ion batteries. The only projects we deem bankable at this point are lithium-ion up to 4-hour discharge time. We would not lend into novel technology projects without qualifications. The main driver of projects will be higher renewables. So countries, markets with high levels of renewables will then see more demand for batteries sooner. And sooner than in emerging markets, this will happen sooner than, for example, in Europe, where countries like Denmark run on 50% renewables, but they have a very, very overbuilt grid. In emerging markets, we will hit that demand earlier. We will see continued improvements in costs. So we think that the system price will halve by the end of the decade. We are now competitive with newly built gas peakers. There's a race to deploy gas in many markets now, but the new gas resources already within their lifetime have to compete with solar and batteries or wind and batteries. That's for gas investments. Number 6 is, I think, is very that we now have the chance to kill the diesel way of making electricity, and solar and storage, wind and storage can compete with that. And we see putting in other private sector investors. We have a high appetite for risk in emerging markets, and then we will bring in other investors. And just quickly, I think I'm getting towards the end of my time, in that and I can't repeat that often enough, the number one obstacle right now is lack of regulation. And it's almost like a black and white situation that in many OECD markets, in North America, in the EU, in Japan, South Korea, there is regulation on storage. In most emerging markets, there is none. And we know what works. We don't have to reinvent the wheel, and we need to get these lessons learned from OECD countries and get stable market rules for storage in emerging markets. And the main drivers for policymakers there is market design, but also capital and infrastructure investment to use storage in existing systems, and especially around planning. And just let me pick out one or two examples. Most consultants that we all use in the industry still have in-house tools for modeling storage. So they would have an in-house model that they plug into Plexos, for example, but it's a black box. It's hard to understand, and different consultants get to vastly different. It has to be more standardized. On compensation, it's clear that especially ancillary services need a marketplace, and we need regulation for that. On procurement, we need to standardize PPAs, and for example, policymakers can advance that by running auctions in a finalized way. And for example, the World Bank and IFC has a scaling solar program that tries to help that. And finally, on integration, interconnection queues are an obstacle, are a delay, and the more we can accelerate interconnection with storage resources, the faster we can develop the market. And a few examples from we can see is, on the one hand, is California, which has followed a very aggressive top-down mandate-driven regulatory regime, and with that has very aggressively driven storage into the market. And here's one example of SCE with 100 megawatt 4-hour project that has preempted the replacement of a gas plant with a new gas plant. So we're already seeing gas investments being stopped because they're preempted by solar and storage. Hawaii, Hawaii is very interesting. All the PPAs there are being made public. The recent 2020 PPAs, I think, point to the future of what a bankable project can look like, with a mix of capacity and energy payments, and that's a very good example for creating. Australia is one of the strongest markets as well, especially on non-wires alternatives. And so to finalize on regulation, regulators need to have a focus opening up the market for resources, establish a credible market signal that remains over time. Regulatory barriers, for example, in the US, there's been the debate around using storage resources as a generation asset and transmission asset at the same time. Simply interconnection queue and ensure fair competition for all benefits, for example, ancillary services. Thank you.
Peter, thank you very much for your presentation. Very clear. So it's not only about technology, obviously, but it's to make it happen and to get the right investment and securing, or how should I say, assuring the investor that he gets his money back. The next speaker will be Julian. Julian, I think you can, yeah, that's working. You can take over for the case study and the stackings and so on. Please, the floor is yours.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, very well.
Wonderful. So great. Well, thank you so much for having me, first of all. It's great to be presenting today, and I think it's a really crucial topic on how we can advance energy storage opportunities across emerging markets. So yeah, fantastic to be having this talk, and it's great to see so many attendees on this as well. Brief introduction, I won't spend too much time on it, but just so you're aware, I'm an associate director at IHS Markit. I'm responsible for our clean tech and renewable energy consulting practice, but I have been prior to that leading our energy storage research for the past 4 years. And just for those of you who don't know us, IHS Markit, we're a huge firm providing critical data and analysis, but on the energy storage industry, really important to be aware. We do provide the most comprehensive coverage and data with a team of 10 dedicated energy storage analysts located across the world, and tying into our power practice as well. So really for comprehensive data, market analysis, competitive analysis, this is really where we see ourselves playing, and where we can help clients across the world understand this industry better, and understand how the market developments will change and allow you to capture the opportunities across this emerging industry. What I'll be talking about today will be really just a brief overview of the key opportunities in selected emerging markets. I'll talk a bit about the impact of COVID-19 as well, because I feel like at the end of 2020, and actually no one has mentioned it yet really, I feel like this is my place to just talk about it a little bit, and then really dig into some key case studies from emerging markets. And I think a lot of those case studies will really illustrate what Peter was talking about, because Peter highlighted how market design and financing plays a crucial role in enabling storage growth. And what I'll be doing is just show you a few case studies to illustrate and underline it, so really tying into quite nicely into that. One thing to just highlight, all the data, all the information I'll be showing is all part of our clean energy technology service, specifically the energy storage module within that. And if you're interested in that, feel free to contact me afterwards, and I'm excited to have a conversation with you about that. But let's get started straight away. So when we look at energy storage in emerging markets, I think there's 3 key areas that stand out. And what we've seen over the last over the last year and a half or so, we've seen that tender programs by governments and utilities, so especially state-owned utility companies, are what's driving initial growth in this market. In particular, we saw more than or close to 3 gigawatt of new tenders and targets being announced over the last 18 months or so. Particular prominent examples are, for example, in South Africa with the Eskom tender, but also especially in the Middle East and places like Abu Dhabi and Oman, announcing quite significant storage tenders within those markets. But at the same time, those tender programs, and they kind of tie into what Louis said earlier, they are often a bit fickle. So, we saw, for example, in Jordan, we saw a tender canceled, which then undermines investor confidence in those markets and create challenges. So what we're also seeing in some other markets is the creation of ancillary services markets. So really enabling lower cost, reliable electricity supply, and allowing storage to provide critical services such as frequency regulation that help the grid operator maintain the grid frequency and as such supply. And then finally, and this is a point we've already talked about a little bit, is around infrastructure constraints. And I think a really good example here is Chile. Chile is obviously a very long country, but a very thin country. And what we see often is that there's significant transmission constraints trying to get renewable generation that's in one part of the country transmitted across the country. And as renewable penetration grows in places with weaker grids, those infrastructure constraints will become more pronounced, and battery energy storage has a really important role to play in helping to counteract that. But also, this is kind of the picture that was drawn maybe at the start of 2020, and I think it was a really positive story. But then, of course, COVID-19 happened, and we're all aware of the impact across the world. I think something that's quite important to say, at IHS Markit, we really track the development of stationary storage market, and 2020 has actually been a fantastic year. We've seen record growth of deployment. We think 2020 is going to be the greatest deployment figures for battery energy storage globally to date. However, at the same time, it is those emerging markets that are particularly sensitive to the economic downturn, but also regulatory delays, because there's a lot of focus, of course, on how to tackle COVID-19 and how to mitigate the economic impacts on there. So what we've seen is significant delays, cancellations of tender processes. We've seen big financial and logistical risks for utilities. So there's a lot of utilities that are in financial difficulties, and that is kind of exacerbating the the pressures on new investments that they might do. And in the Middle East in particular, the oil price declined earlier in the year, because that's created a real risk for storage projects in that region, as those countries' economies are of course closely tied to the oil and gas sector, and a revenue decline in that in those sectors has a large impact on the wider economies in that regions. And that means then potentially that investment into new technologies such as storage may be paused or delayed there. But it's not all doom and gloom. So when we look at the fundamental impact of COVID-19, we had short-term disruption, lockdowns, the overall panic that we saw in kind of February, March, April across the world. We then had project delays, tender cancellations, and yes, of course, it's not good for the storage industry. But also, if we look at those markets where that's happening, the situation is easing now. But at the same time, across all the different emerging markets that I'll be talking about in my case studies, we see very, very strong market fundamentals. So the real baseline drivers are there for storage, and that will continue driving market growth. And when we think about that market growth, let's think about what will storage be doing and how will storage be supporting the market. And Luis talked about this a little bit earlier on, and I just want to dig into the use cases for storage a bit more before I start explaining those country case studies. So fundamentally, and this is really why battery storage is so unique, you know, whenever I present to regulators, to stakeholders in countries or markets where they may be less familiar with the technology, I always try to highlight this. Storage is not like a generation technology. It can do so many more things, and it can do all these things simultaneously. And what we've seen is that as batteries have become cheaper and cheaper, they're becoming more competitive for longer duration applications, up to 8 hours, which allows them to not just provide the high power, short duration applications such as frequency, but also provide critical capacity, as Peter highlighted in the example of California, and provide renewable firming, conventional enhancement, and support of transmission and distribution infrastructure. Now, of course, I think there was a point made earlier on that if you go into longer duration in terms of day or storage over days, or maybe even seasonal, of course, batteries are not optimal. But I would really caution against dismissing batteries, because those opportunities, they're not there today, and they won't be there until 2030 in the minimum. So really over the next decade, the very large majority of the stationary storage market and the requirement for storage in our energy systems is really going to be satisfied by lithium-ion batteries. I think the other thing to highlight here, and again, apologies, Luis, if I fundamentally have to disagree with you here, but actually there's two elements to this. We think a lot of the markets, with the exception of, for example, South Korea, actually haven't been policy or incentive, well, they've been policy driven, but not incentive driven. They've been driven by the fact that storage is allowed to compete on a level playing field in different types of energy markets, whether that's ancillary services markets, so frequency markets in the UK, and the common European FCR market in PJM in California, or whether that's storage being allowed to participate in wholesale markets without barriers, as FERC Order 841 allowed in the United States. That's what's creating growth in the market, rather than some form of incentive programs like what we saw for renewables maybe 10 years ago. And I think this is a really important point for anyone in emerging markets, so whether you're a regulator, whether you're a utility. This is not about subsidizing storage. It's about creating the frameworks that allow storage to compete. And as soon as you create those frameworks, storage will outcompete different types of resources for a lot of these applications, especially as prices have become cheaper and cheaper. So one thing to highlight though is that storage can't just provide one of these applications. Storage can provide multiple applications. And this is what we call value stacking. Now I've brought out here this very specific example. This is from California. I'm using this as an illustration. And it shows you how storage can, for example, have a capacity contract. So this is basically for peaking capacity whenever there's a shortfall in the system. Storage will be dispatched, and that's often contracted by the utility. But then storage can participate in a range of merchant markets. So whether that's day-ahead energy trading, whether that's real-time, so intraday wholesale trading, or frequency regulation. And the great benefit of storage is that it can stack all these different revenues, and as such create a profitable project case. As we highlight here in this specific example, the revenue requirement range is around that $200 per kilowatt per year mark, and storage projects in that market are most likely to be able to achieve that. But now what does that mean for emerging markets? Because I think the key message here is this is one of the most mature, most established energy storage markets in the world. And because of all the groundwork laid by regulators over time, now storage can actually compete in all these markets. And if we go back a few years, storage may have only been competing in frequency or only been having a capacity contract. And it's only now that storage is allowed to stack those different revenue streams. And I think this is a really key message to keep in mind as we jump to the case studies that I will highlight. In terms of the case studies, I will talk first about Eastern Europe and what's happening there. Then I'll talk about India, because I think India is one of these most exciting opportunities in terms of market fundamentals. But we need to look at why the market is being held back, because right now it's a very, very small market. And then lastly, the Philippines, because I think it's a really nice example of where a regulator is taking storage in the right direction, but then the wider challenges in that market are holding deployment back. So let's talk about Eastern Europe first. Eastern Europe, initially we had pilot projects, and particularly in Czechia and Poland. In Czechia, these were primarily to test the ability of storage to play into frequency markets. In Poland, these were utility run or distribution company run pilots on the distribution grid to help test different use cases and help understand the ability to support the network infrastructure. However, the big opportunity over the coming 5 years or so is going to be around frequency markets. And that could be either established ones like Czechia, like Slovenia. In Slovenia, we're seeing 13 megawatt storage was deployed last year. In 2020, we've seen another 15 megawatt come online. In Czechia, a similar story, although the frequency opportunity is less strong. The big challenge around these markets is that they're very, what we call shallow. So it's a very limited amount of frequency regulation that is required in each country. And as such, it limits the ability of storage to participate. And that means the bigger opportunity with regards to frequency in our eyes is particularly in the Ukraine and as well as in the Baltics, because both the Ukraine and the Baltics are looking to decrease their reliance and interconnection with the Russian grid and instead integrate with the European transmission system. But the European network of transmission system operators for electricity, NSOE, basically has requirements to integrate with the European energy market that requires the TSOs of each of those countries to guarantee a certain volume of primary frequency control. And that means that both Ukrenergo and the system operator in Lithuania are now looking at or announced the intention to procure large storage deployments in order to allow them to join the common European transmission system. When we look at India, and I'm conscious of time, so I'll be fairly quick here now, but if we look at India, great market fundamentals, right? In India, we're going to see solar installation go from 34 gigawatts in 2020 to 153 gigawatts in 2030. Huge solar capacity online. The Central Electricity Authority has already come out that they envisage over 27 gigawatts of battery storage by 2030, complemented with 10 gigawatts of pumped hydro to manage the increasing variability in demand and supply. But the big challenge is these fundamentals are great, right? You've got huge renewable uptake, you've got weak infrastructure, you need to electrify large parts of the country. However, at the same time, the tender programs that have been designed have been extremely unreliable. They've been withdrawn, redesigned, come out again, withdrawn again. And we've finally now seen this first large tender being successful. But again, this tender required a round-the-clock contract, so to speak, so almost very long duration storage. So again, it wasn't necessarily designed to the benefits of battery energy storage, but it may have been over-designed because actually in most cases, you don't need such a thing as round-the-clock time shifting. You just need kind of 4 to 6 hours to really manage the intermittency of renewable plants. But also long-term, there's going to be a huge need for system flexibility in the Indian market. I think just for the benefit of time, I'm consciously aware that I'm probably going over already. I will skip the Philippines, but I would just highlight with the Philippines here, regulators have done a great job to actually create the frameworks and classify storage within the regulatory text. However, the typical challenges in a region like Southeast Asia are around permitting, are about the reliance of bilateral contracts. So you don't have a very easy permitting system and you don't have a merchant market where you're procuring ancillary services. And that just holds back storage deployment. There's huge potential, but very slow actual realization of projects because of those challenges. So that takes us really to the key conclusions. What we need to do in any of these emerging markets and elsewhere in the world storage needs to be very clearly defined in regulatory frameworks. It needs to be treated in a level playing field with other technologies. And what needs to be accounted for properly is the value that it can provide into the electricity system in each of those markets. Creating technology agnostic markets for system flexibility or frequency regulation is the easiest way to enable quick uptake of energy storage, but at the same time, actually increasing the reliability of your energy system and decreasing the cost of maintaining your electricity system. So really kind of triple whammy of positive effects. Finally, we need to have clear approaches to integrate and reward storage as a pivotal asset. And then finally, and Peter talked about this already, so I won't talk about this in detail, is really access to low-cost financing, project development expertise in these markets to enable quicker uptake with storage. And I think then storage can play such a crucial part in accelerating the energy transition across emerging markets.
Thank you very much, Julian. Very comprehensive and very clear. I'm sure there will be some questions afterwards in the Q&A. We have already some, so we can elaborate a bit more on the details. With this, I will hand over to the last speaker now, which is Emin. Emin, could you share your screen? And then the floor would be all yours.
Hey, hello, Patrick.
Yes, we see your screen, but not in presentation mode.
Okay, I will now launch the presentation. Is it clear?
Perfect.
See that? Okay. Excellent. Thank you. So, my name is Emin Askerov. I am the CEO of Renera. It's a company, a part of Rosatom Group. Rosatom is the Russian state nuclear energy corporation. And Renera is the part that is dealing with manufacturing of energy storage systems. And I will tell about several showcases of how you actually can implement storage and how you go about localizing storage and what kind of projects, apart from the types that have already been presented to you by other speakers, you can have. So, for example, let me first show you this short video. This is one kind of example that you can have in a storage application. This is a battery. This is a battery for an electric cart, which we made just this year. And in October, we had this very nice competition. It's a kid's cart, and it's for kids aged 9 to 12. But it's fast, can go up to 95 kilometers per hour, and it looks nice. So this is one kind of use case. And so we've been focusing mostly on Russian use cases here. And first of all, we have estimated what is the Russian capacity, Russian market capacity for storage, specifically for lithium-ion storage. So there are several forecasts up from 1 gigawatt hour in 2030 to 6 gigawatt hours 2030. So this is conservative to optimistic. And this may not sound as much, but even this amount is good enough to actually start some action in manufacturing of storage systems. So what are the key drivers here we have? So first, one of the first driver is the electricity network. It's the state of the electricity network in low voltage areas. There you usually have the need for security of supply, and there you can install small, like 20 kilowatt, 40 kilowatt lithium-ion storage. It's this year, one of the grid operators installed about 30 such systems in the area of its operations. So the other driver is electric buses. I usually tell that you see in any, there are two drivers for the deployment of storage. The first is the commitment of the governments of the country to decarbonization in energy. and very clear targets in the share of renewable energy generation. And the second driver is the clear targets in electric mobility, in prohibiting the sale of internal combustion engines. We don't have either of those in Russia. Only in several cities, notably Moscow and St. Petersburg, have the cities actively and on their own, without any government support, without any federal government support, enacted programs to switch completely to fully electric public transport. And that created a very big drive for at least assembly of the batteries and design of the batteries for the buses that are produced in Russia. With the renewables, we have a very different story. Renewables are not the driver, despite the fact that we in Rosatom recently commissioned 160 megawatt wind farm, and there will be 3 gigawatt of wind farms commissioned in the next 3 years. This will not drive the adoption of lithium-ion. The thing is that we have very stable grid, excess capacity in the grid, and the system operator of the grid doesn't require any storage for renewables. So currently the share of renewables in generation is about 1%. After all the commissioning, the share will increase to 2 or 3% top. So we still don't have this penetration of renewables. So that's why, even though the construction is underway, 3 companies are building this wind turbines and wind farms, there is no demand from the renewable sector. So if we go a bit, take a deeper dive in this, in these use cases. So for the electric buses, we see it as the major source of demand. And we see about 1 to 2 gigawatt hour per year manufacturing capacity, which will be for batteries in the next 10 years for electric buses. After Moscow and St. Petersburg adopt the electric transport, we see that other cities will follow and modernize their quite outdated bus fleet. By that time, the price should drop significantly so that cities with smaller budgets than Moscow and St. Petersburg will be able to afford electric transport. We see that now, for example, in Moscow, for those of you who are more technically inclined in the battery business, Moscow now uses lithium titanate anode batteries to run their electric buses, and these are very expensive. So Moscow is looking to switch maybe in a year or 2 to other types, which are less expensive, but also quite reliable. So we see that as a main driver. For example, this gave birth to quite a few startups in Russia, which engineer the drivetrain with the battery, and then they source the battery from China or from Japan or from Korea and sell it to the bus manufacturer. There is one Russian cell manufacturer, but that company appeared more than 10 years ago, and we plan to open our own cell factory in the next 4 years in Russia. And yes, the electric buses will be the key reason why we do this. They provide stable demand every year, and that demand is growing. So use case 2, this is more practical. Here, it's a shift from lead acid to lithium-ion. So on the left picture, you see, this is the actual pictures from one of our manufacturing plants in Russia. We had this we have this company called Ural Electrochemical Combine, and they have a substation DC. They have a substation, electric substation, 110 kV, and they have a DC system there. So before they used lead acid, and then they switched to lithium ion. So you see the before and after pictures. So before we had to have specially trained staff to look after the lead acid batteries, had to have a specially designed room, ventilated, fireproofed, so that these batteries be maintained. But now they're like just a few cupboards, and there you have the lithium-ion batteries, and that's it. Nobody's there. So basically, actually, the first time we built this, we oversized it by, I think, 2 times, just to be sure. But even then, even with oversizing, we managed to have a payback period of 3 years. So this is a very interesting kind of project where you basically, it's an energy efficiency project, or just efficiency, operational cost efficiency project, where you switch from the old lead acid to the new lithium ion. And there is one other case where we did the same. There is no funky picture, but we have so-called logistic transport at the factories, you know, the forklifts, electric forklifts which drive around. And they also used lead acid batteries, and we also replaced with the very same forklifts, which may be 30 years old, but we replaced the lead acid with the new lithium ion. And we are now, you see this dotted line, and at this point in time, we are reaping the rewards. So in 2 years, we'll have the payback. We'll be breaking even, sorry. And the payback starts from 2023. So it's the same use case, basically, because we also get rid of the special room to look after the lead acid. And the costs of maintaining lead acid batteries has been driven down. And, you know, lithium ion is just very easy to maintain. And the final use case is a peak shaving and energy management. So this is the container, like a 20-foot container that will be installed this month at one of the industrial sites, where it will be used to save money, basically, on electricity bills at one of the manufacturing facilities that we have. We have a special company, it's named here, Atomenergopromsbyt, very difficult name to pronounce, but the core is, this is a commercial company that buys and sells electricity. And they run the project, they are the investor, and they have their own algorithm which determines when it's best to buy and sell electricity, basically, and they use the lithium-ion container as a buffer to make that business model work. I can say, so first of all, this is a commercial project, it works. IRR is good, NPV is positive. It could have been better, but in Russia, the electricity prices are not that high. So in the areas, if you have a very high electricity price, this kind of projects may work, and may work quite well. So we also looking at the localization of manufacturing. So today, it's already localized in the sense that we assemble the batteries. So we get the cells, we get the cells imported, we assemble the modules, we assemble the packs, and then sell it to the final user. But we also look to localize cells, but this may be a bit more difficult usually if you don't have the big enough market. The localization of cells is quite costly. And we are looking to European market as a possible export route. First of all, Russia is closer than China or Korea in that sense, and the delivery time is important. Using the weak currency, the ruble, to drive down the price of exports. And we also now formulating an integrated offer to not just sell the batteries, but kind of lease them for a long time and then take them back to recycle and remanufacture if possible. So in Russia, we're looking for the 40% market share, not a big market, but still, and the 3 GWh manufacturing, much of that for exports. So these are basically the use cases. As you can see, the idea is that you have to look not only the typical places where you can use the lithium-ion batteries like renewables or frequency control, but there are quite a few other interesting places where you can find use for your engineering skills and your manufacturing capabilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Emin. Thanks for the presentation. This concludes our presentation round, and there are different questions. Maybe we can start directly, Emin, with you, and the others now can put on their camera if they want and open their microphone. So should be a kind of a discussion, meaning that you can add to what others said or take the floor in a civilized way, as we will obviously do it. And I will start with the first question I had about leasing of batteries. Emin, could you elaborate a bit on its leasing? This was one of the questions.
So it's basically what we found here. What we found out here is that the customer usually has quite a limited budget, and if you come to them saying this is the lithium-ion battery, please buy it, it's usually a bit more expensive than any alternative, and the customer doesn't really believe that this battery doesn't require servicing, it will last longer, and so on and so forth. So they usually have the very short time, very short horizon in which they can make an investment decision. And they say, okay, please give me a 10-year warranty on the battery, which can be a case, but not many manufacturers do that. One other way is to pass on that risk and to make your offer more enticing to your customer is to say, okay, I will not sell you the battery, but you can lease it from me. You can borrow it from me for 10 years. And after 10 years, I come back and I take back your battery and I recycle it, no costs. And you will pay me each year installments. And then you can structure it the way you want. You can structure it with the any annuity payments, or you can structure it per kilowatt hour discharge from the battery, and so on and so forth. This requires you to be in a partnership with a strong financial institution, which has the cost of capital to beat.
Good. Thank you very much. I don't know if someone wants to add on this.
Yeah,
otherwise,
actually, I would love
please.
to, Patrick, if that's okay, because I think it's an interesting piece, and it's a business model people have tried to develop and actually then failed to develop. And I think the fundamental challenge, and what it always comes down to, is that the ultimate project costs end up being a lot bigger. Now, it might work for very specific use cases and very specific application where the flexibility is needed, but where we're looking at the bulk of the market, where we're deploying very large scale storage projects to take advantage of economies of scale, and where basically the project payback time is intended to be 5 to 7 years. It's really all about reducing the capex investment, and that's the core focus, making that project bankable at very low capex. And that's been the kind of downfall of the leasing model. I think I wrote about it like 5 years ago. I love the idea and it's a great principle, but the way the market has been going, it's kind of undermined the ability to deploy that model, with the exception of, for example, off-grid, microgrid, hybridization. Mining sector is a great example where it works, because there the investor or the company that buys it doesn't really want a long-term asset. They want to be able to stop it at any time because the mine might shut down.
That's actually true. Yeah, Julian. I would completely agree with you, and I wouldn't suggest that kind of business model. So if you're selling batteries for electric vehicles, electric cars. I mean, like private cars. But for example, we are active talks with two manufacturers of electric buses, whose customers are municipalities, and municipalities do take a different kind of view on that. Also, I know that in Europe it didn't take off, but in niche markets, I believe it can have you can have a go at it.
Thank you. Okay, we had our questions. Maybe Peter, would you see this the financing for more hybrid projects like battery and hydropower, or PV and battery, or wind and battery, and so on? Is the route to go with this take off, or would it still be standalone and then linked to the system?
Well, first of all, the market in the emerging market plays out differently from the US. In the US, you lose the investment tax credit if you build your storage standalone. So there's a strong tax-driven incentive to bundle storage with renewables in the US. So we first expected the projects in emerging markets to look like the US projects, and they didn't. And I think the ITC is the main driver for that. And so there are more standalone projects in emerging markets than we would have thought. From a lender's perspective, it's still better to bundle it, because there's a higher technical risk associated with the storage, because it's newer. So in an ideal case, the project can still pay back its debt even if the battery stops working on day one. That's ideal. So if you bake a relatively small battery into a larger renewables project, but I recognize that that's not always possible. But if the renewable part of the project is much larger than the storage project, is clearly better for the risk profile and for the bankability. But eventually, I think that's just a transitionary phase. Eventually, our storage will be recognized as a bankable asset, and does not need to be bundled with from a bankability perspective. From a technical perspective, it may make a lot of sense to bundle it.
So not from an economic perspective necessarily, financing perspective necessarily. Would you see that there are examples of low-cost financing? Was one of the questions for storage in emerging markets. Would you have an example on low-cost financing? I don't know what this exactly means.
Well, I mean, so what we do is, for example, IFC invests at market rates, whatever that means, and a test is that we always co-invest with at least one private sector investor. We don't do rounds only by development banks, for example. We need one profit-oriented institutional investor to validate the pricing. What we can do is blend our finance with, for example, viability gap financing for particularly innovative projects, for particularly challenging markets. So what we can do, and other development banks frankly do that too, is that for particularly interesting projects, there's what we call blended finance that reduces the financing costs. It doesn't mean it's a subsidy of a white elephant, but it can close a 5-10% viability gap that otherwise wouldn't be commercially fundable.
It's a kind of subsidy.
It's a yeah, you may say that. You may say that. I couldn't possibly comment, but it's a viability gap funding.
Okay, fine, good. Thank you very much, Louis. There's a question for you also about the development of energy storage behind the meter. Do you see this coming? Is this what's happening?
So behind the meter. So yeah, what are the drivers? I think for behind the meter. So
yes.
I mean, behind the meter, so we see in some jurisdictions is already behind the meter. In Germany, for example, 50,000, I think last year, systems were installed, solar PV systems were installed with the batteries, more than half of all the systems. So that's in Japan as well. There's a subsidy that's being phased out for solar PV, a feed-in tariff, and there's a reaction from consumers to start going out there and buying battery systems. So what we're seeing is that in many countries, behind the meter is being adopted, even though it doesn't make economic sense through the lifetime of the project. So it happens in Japan, it happens in a number of countries in Europe, in some places in Australia as well, even though it's quite attractive. And then the other trend we're seeing there is that for new projects, so when there's a new development, and there's solar PV being considered, storage is also, behind the meter storage is also being bundled into the development. And that happens a lot in Australia, also in New Zealand, and utilities are taking quite an active interest in that as well. So they're also directly collaborating in these projects and trying to aid in the, solar PV being already deployed with some form of behind the meter. So I would say, like, I mean, in many cases, there's obviously metering mechanisms that are allowing for some consumers to really profit from that, especially in the US. But in many cases, actually, it's quite interesting to see the trend that it's not economically viable. And yeah, it would be interesting to hear from other panelists as well.
Julian, do you want to add to this from a market perspective point of view?
Yeah, very, very keen to. I think, I mean, it's a really important question, but fundamentally we have to divide it by the residential and by the commercial industrial segment. For those two segments are really very different drivers. I think I won't add anything to the residential segment because Luis has already explained that extensively. But I think fundamentally, when we look at the context of emerging markets, in most cases, we don't have a residential solar market. We often have subsidized low cost of electricity. So there won't really be a case for residential unless you have very rich customers who are looking to get rid of their diesel generator. There's examples in India where people can't run their diesel generator because of air pollution. So actually they might buy a battery just because they want to have backup power. But fundamentally, when we look at the commercial industrial segment, it's been a really promising but very challenging segment because there it's all about rate structures. So it depends, can you reduce your peak demand, for example, to avoid a specific peak charge, which is the case, for example, in Canada, in California, in Germany. But again, here it's a very challenging segment because you have a lot of very small projects. So the business development and customer acquisition effort is very expensive and it doesn't give you, well, you basically have the same customer acquisition effort for a 1 megawatt project or a 500 kilowatt project, or you could do a 50 megawatt project. So logically, it's much more challenging for the companies. But in the emerging market context, I think at the moment, this has not been explored enough, and financing here, I think, plays a core role. But for a lot of commercial industrial customers, reliability plays a huge role, whether that's in Africa, whether that's in Southeast Asia, and they all rely on diesel generation. And I think we're getting to a point where it's very clear that either a hybrid model or solar plus storage on its own can basically displace new diesel generators in those contexts. And I think it's all about educating those customers, because once they make the investment, they're not going to get rid until the diesel generator breaks again. So I think we have a real educational effort there. But overall, our view is that emerging markets and globally, front of the meter will be the dominant segment. Behind the meter, especially in the residential market, will grow in certain pockets, but fundamentally the bulk, I believe it's around 65% global deployment out to 2025 is going to be front of the meter driven.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe if I can have another question about the chemistry. Eamon, you mentioned about the chemistry, the change of chemistry, which for the buses foreseen and so on. What do you see, which chemistry will be really driving this? Also, maybe you have any crystal ball you can take and say which other chemistry will come. And then maybe for everyone also, what is the case with these batteries, which is driven by electric vehicles afterwards? Is this something with a second life? Is this something where you have a new investment for a new project, and then is the bankability better because it has been amortized first, or what is it? So first of all, the chemistry, Eamon, please. You would like to?
Yeah. So we see that, okay, if you just look at the technical side and who's manufacturing what, I mean, the nickel, manganese, cobalt, NMC batteries are now on the rise. The lithium ferrum phosphate, like LFP batteries, which have been the bulk of the lithium ion market so far, are still doing well, but just they're giving up some ground. In Russia, interestingly enough, we have the head-on competition between NMC, LFP, and even LTO for different uses. But what we see is that a customer doesn't really care about your chemistry. You have to sell your product on what it is used for. I mean, what is the...
So it's this application, the service is more important than the chemistry.
Exactly. And then if you can, apart from that, if you can convince your customer that your battery is 100% safe, fireproof, and so on. It also makes your business case easier. So we are betting more on the NMC, more flexible. They're a bit more expensive than LFP batteries, but the use cases, there are many more use cases for NMC. And so we're betting that on scale, NMC can be very good.
Okay. Can I have a bit from everyone the point on the second life of batteries and the applications, and maybe is this project easier and so on? Louis, you want to start, or you want to add on what Emin said?
Yes, thank you, Patrick. Yes, I was just going to add, because I think in the question is embedded the idea of, what are the kind of chemistries that are going to dominate, given that you have all these EV batteries that are going to be deployed. And so there's always the question, or at least we get the question a lot on, how much is what's happening on EVs going to spill over to what's happening on grid scale, given already it's like 10 times greater the market for EV batteries. Yes. So, I mean, if we look at 2019, which is the last year where we looked at this, so maybe 60% of grid scale batteries around the world are already currently NMC blends, which is the technology of choice for EVs. And EV battery manufacturers, they have a certain way of thinking around how to develop the technology, which they look at energy density, reducing upfront costs, or increasing EV range, for example. And this doesn't really have a lot of impact on stationary applications. And maybe you can resize some of the components, smaller housing and so on. But the interesting part for stationary batteries is that as we have like supply chains constantly being updated and going towards the next kind of high performing blend or the chemistry, technologies that maybe become less attractive for EVs, they can be deployed at a lower cost for stationary applications on the grid. And that's quite interesting. For example, in China, we just mentioned LFP batteries. And in 2019, in China, there were the majority of grid scale installations. And one reason is the Chinese government tightened some of the energy density requirement for EV batteries. And there was an overcapacity. And then you have this lower density technology, is less attractive, but then it can be shifted to grid scale applications. Okay. So that's quite.
It's coming a bit what Emin said. It depends on the application you want to do. It's depending what you're looking for, and then there are some criteria in the services. Peter, you think that this second life of the batteries is something which is easy financeable? Is it something where you trust the batteries?
Well, we've been looking out for this for best part of the past 5 years, and we haven't yet met a single business that has presented us with a business case for second life. So nobody has figured out how to do this. Once you do, I think there's a great business waiting there. Currently, you can get second life EV batteries for cents on the dollar because nobody knows what to do with them. So if you can figure that out, I think there's a great business opportunity, but we haven't met anyone who's solved that yet.
Julian, will it be figured out in the near future? You see this business case rising and growing?
No. I'll give you a very short answer. I don't see the second life piece growing particularly strongly, and I'll give you kind of two core reasons. The first one is the financeability, as Peter alluded to, but mainly around who's going to provide you a warranty with a second life battery that's already been used. You don't have visibility of how it's been used, and you're going to put that into a critical grid application. I don't think anyone's going to want to insure that or provide a warranty for that. Of course, there's certain mini applications, niches where it doesn't matter. But, if you're putting this in to provide critical grid infrastructure, no one's going to want to insure this. This is number one. Second piece is that the other real area of focus is battery recycling. And that's a much, much bigger topic, because even if you use second life and you use as many first life batteries in second life applications as you can, there's going to be a large percentage that you can't use. Our calculation is that only around 20% of batteries coming out of electric vehicles are usable in second life context.
Why?
Mainly around the health of the cell. And basically what you need to do is you need to disassemble the pack. You need to test each individual cell.
So it's a cost issue and
it's a cost issue and a battery
reliability.
Battery health issue. Okay. And then basically what that means, you still have 80% that needs to be recycled. So you're going to scale up recycling because you need to do that anyway. So that means eventually recycling is going to be much larger scale, much more cost effective. you're going to be able to get virgin material, well, not virgin materials, but you're going to get materials out that can compete with virgin materials. So what's the point of having a second life for the battery then? And I think that's the direction we're going to go. And as much as I would love this kind of circular model, I think in terms of the mass market and the realities of the applications and the realities of the recycling need, actually, I think it's going to be more sustainable to really build up very strong, very good recycling that's going to have a better effect than basically trying to shift responsibility for old batteries onto someone else. And then who knows where they'll end up after the second life.
I would have a question to all of you. Do you think, so Europe is looking at the carbon border adjustment mechanism. You maybe heard of this. It's making a kind of tax on the CO2 footprint, depending on how much CO2 footprint these batteries have. Do you think this is a good way of building up own capacities, own equipment? Or will this be something which will be difficult to achieve the desired effect of having a lower battery CO2 footprint globally, which is the desired effect? Anyone who wants to talk about this very thorny topic, but it's something which is interesting?
Let me try.
Yes,
you
want to export to Europe, to the European Union.
That's why. And well, I think it's a very it's a very good policy in general, not specifically for promotion of the at-home manufacturing, but good policy in general towards, like, globally. I mean, towards the main goal of all of this is the fighting of climate change. As Europe is a very big importer, and when it sets the rules, basically you have to play along. And for Russia, I think it's very good, like a wake-up call, that look, we export. Europe is one of our main trading partners, and we export a lot. And already, like, Russian aluminum producers already make low carbon aluminum and so on. I mean, nickel, they make.
So we see it on other parts, it's working already.
Yes, we see other parts is working already. For us, specifically for batteries, I think it will not play that big a role. It just sets the standard. I think the bigger role is the costs and the shipment time. That should play.
Well, you're nearer for the, okay.
Yeah.
That's all clear. Can I ask you, if you want, for all four speakers, if you have 20 seconds to give me, and I let you think while I speak, to give me one main sentence how you see that storage will develop, maybe differently than in the emerging market and in the more mature markets. How will it develop? And maybe one driver you see will make this difference. And I know it's not fair for the last one who's having to choose, so I will take you, Julian, as the last one, because you I know you're the best. And I would ask Peter, what do you think for this driving on the maybe financial point of view?
Yeah, I think there's more diversity in projects because you don't have that tax drive they have in the US for projects. So it's a whole zoo of projects out there, standalone, combined, on the grid side, behind the meter. I think it's more diverse.
Louis, what would you say?
So I was going to say I was going to make Peter's point, but then otherwise I will probably say those kind of projects where there's issues with interconnection, or where there's I mean, this is we're really seeing in many markets where this is kind of an emerging application. So yes. Yeah, I would say maybe stick with that one.
Thank you. Amy, what would you see?
I would say have an open mind. As my examples demonstrate, you can find classical example of very, very strange, but also very good and profitable examples.
The zoo again. Julian.
Yeah, trying to do it really short. I think it's all about understanding the very diverse value storage provides, and as such that it's an enabler to meet your own decarbonization goals in a secure and cheaper or lower cost way than you otherwise would. So don't dismiss it because it's expensive. Understand the value and understand that it helps you decarbonize.
Great. Thank you very much. So basically we saw today that energy storage is something which is rolling out more and more on an economic basis also, because it makes sense. It has a lot of value streams. The financing, they're getting more used to it. And we need some basic rules, some legislation, some political support in order to get it done, but it will be rolled out. That's all from my side. Thank you for all the 4 speakers. Inessa, I hand back to you, maybe to close down the session. And
Sure.
for all the others, have a nice rest of the week.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Patrick, for leading this. And thank you to Peter, Julian, Luis, and Emin for very interesting presentations. And thank you for all the participants. All the presentations will be made available to you within 24 hours. I would just like to, assuming that everyone is interested in emerging markets, I'd like to take this opportunity to speak a little bit about Enerloop. This is the tool that we have developed this year, which enables companies to access individual country profiles with comprehensive and up-to-date power industry data and analysis. It is designed to benefit companies within the whole value chain of energy market, including private developers, EPC companies, engineering firms, law firms, technology suppliers, and it covers emerging markets. We are launching our Georgia page by the end of the year. And if you're interested, please request a demo. We will be happy to demonstrate the platform to you. I think I'll leave a link. I don't know, somehow I cannot share that screen, but I will share with you the link so that you can check out. Thank you so much for today's session, and stay tuned, stay safe and healthy. Have a nice day.
Bye. Thank you very
Bye.
much.
Bye.
Bye to everyone.